I love Cinderella. It's one of my favorite books from my childhood. I remember my parents reading it to me, but I also heard it from my grandparents, but they were not telling it from a book, they were saying it orally, which is oral tradition, which has a huge development on children's literature, but it's really close related to folk tales and fairy tales. So oral tradition is a way of forming human connection with knowledge, art, ideas, cultural material that is received, perceived, and transmitted from one to another generation. Now, the one generation is learning from something that the other generation has learned, and they are giving the same message, and that generation can teach that lesson to the next generation, and it just keeps going over and over again. Now, the story can also stick with the receiver because it could have an impact on their life. Now, fairy tales are one type of folklore, but there are 6 other types, and the ones that are different, they're much different from fairy tales. There's folk songs, folk tales, tall tales, ballads, folk drama, and riddles. Now, folk songs are a story or a lesson that's told through song, but the way this people sing is in a narrative version. They're relaying the story or the lesson through their music. Folk tales are a part of culture that have different traditions due to that culture or subculture or group. It has oral traditions, but also has proverbs and jokes. Tall tales are an exaggeration of a story that people want to be true or factual, or it has unbelievable elements that cannot be true in that story. Ballads. They are also tales told through song, but those songs or stories were passed down orally in rural and non-literate communities. Riddles are mostly found in mythology, but also folklore. When a riddle is in a story, they don't want people immediately to guess what the answer is in the end, or immediately on the spot. As the character or the reader, they want them to learn about the riddle and read through the story, and as the character or the reader grows in the story, they can finally figure out or make their own assumptions on what they thought the answer was to the riddle at the first time, and then figure out what it really was. Now, I'm trying to choose a well-known fairy tale. Well, of course, I have to go with Cinderella. That was my favorite as a child, and it still is one of my favorites today. So, whenever someone says, name a good fairy tale, someone's going to say Cinderella. Well, Cinderella was actually not first known as this little dainty princess or girl who lived in the cinders. She was actually from Greece in the 6th century BCE. Instead of she lost her slippers at a ball, and they were actually stolen by an eagle and flew away with her slippers, and then they dropped them on the lap of an Egyptian king. The king started searching for this girl whose slippers, and then he finds her and marries her. Most of the same Cinderella stories follow the same pattern of a girl being treated as a servant, being in a low-class environment, and losing a shoe, and the prince finds her and marries her. The most well-known Cinderella was written by the Brothers Grimm, or that's the one that's mostly well-known to everyone. There are many changes in the Cinderella version that not many people know. At first, Cinderella's slippers were not actually made of glass. That was a rendition of Disney's version. They were actually made of pure gold. And also, in the Disney version, the stepsisters, they can't fit the slipper. Same in any other book, they can't fit the slipper. But in the Grimm's version, actually, one sister cuts off her toes so she can fit the slipper, and the other one cuts off half her heel. But their blood is in the shoe, and the prince can see that and see they're not. Now, of course, Cinderella fits the shoe, and she rides off and lives with the prince. The problem with this story is about class warfare. It's about a low-class woman who's needing a high-class man to give her a better life, And this is seen in movies like Pretty in Pink and My Fair Lady, or it can be flipped to be a low-class man with a low-class woman. Think of Titanic or Aladdin. Now I've just mentioned the Grimm brothers, but there's also two others authors that are very well known, and that's Hans Christian Andersen and Charles Perrault. They are playing familiarity in our folktales and particular fairy tales. Now, what is so interesting about these three authors? Well, let's start with Charles Perrault. He is seen as the founder of fairy tales, even though they previously existed, but he drew his inspiration from stories he had heard that were passed down orally. He's known for writing Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, Puss in Boots, and Sleeping Beauty. The Grimm brothers are the go-to for fairy tales. They are the reason fairy tales are such a popular genre now. The stories they're known for writing is also Cinderella. They had learned from Charles Perrault his Cinderella, but they made a few changes. They also are known for writing The Frog Prince, Hansel and Gretel, Rapunzel, Rumpelstiltskin, and Snow White. They got their inspiration from hearing stories they had heard growing up, but they also took inspiration from Charles Perrault's tale. Now, finally, we have Hans Christian Andersen, a Danish writer. Actually, the brothers Grimms were German, and Charles Perrault was French. Hans Christian Andersen actually was the first author to start writing original fairy tales instead of transcribing them like others had. So he's known for writing The Little Mermaid, The Snow Queen, The Emperor's New Clothes, and The Ugly Duckling. Hans Christian Andersen first started writing stories he had grown up hearing, but then he became more confident with his writing, and he started writing original stories using common themes that are seen in fairy tales. Now, there's problems with fairy tales these days, especially gender issues or violence, and they're relevant today. So the problem is that they can give children false hope. Like in most stories, it ends with, and they lived happily ever after. Okay, that's not true. Children are going to learn that as they grow up, that not all life is going to end happily ever after. We wish it, but life is not a bed of roses, as others say. And another problem is the stories are very shallow, and they say people who are pretty or good looking are the ones that find love, and the ones that are ugly are neglected for the rest of their life. And Cinderella is a perfect example. Cinderella was beautiful, and then she got married to the prince. Her stepsisters were ugly, so they were cast aside. So children will start feeling insecure, and they will start doing things to mirror the characters, and that can be damaging to their bodies. Also, gender issues. Women are seen as maids and can only cook and clean. That was the issue in Snow White. She lived with 7 men, and she was cooking and cleaning for them until she married the prince. It was like her only function. Also, staying with the theme of a prince, it's like women are not capable of doing anything until a man is there that's high class. Children start growing up and start realizing that everything they saw in fairy tales is not at all true, and so they don't want to follow them, and they start wanting to living their own life. So that's the issue with fairy tales. Not saying that fairy tales should be banned, but there are many issues that need to be looked at before fairy tales can be better. So that's how fairy tales are perceived in our daily life. All right.